Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the parallels and differences between Hikikomori and schizoid personality. So before we begin, I would like to talk a bit about the context of this video. So a couple of days ago, I went to a very interesting conference of a sociologist and professor, Maïa Fansten, in which she explained what the Hikikomori state is, which I found very interesting. So I wanted to basically share with you the insights she gave us, but also what I thought of it and the parallels that can be made with a schizoid personality, because as you're going to see throughout these exposures in video, there are quite a few that can be made. So first and foremost, what is the Hikikomori state? Well, it's a concept that was developed by psychiatrist Saito in Japan, in which he saw that individuals were starting to self-isolate. The meaning of Hikikomori in Japanese means basically confined to the self or pulling inwards. So basically he saw that many individuals were starting to basically become more and more introverted, did not leave the home, and the parents started to take care of them and they withdrew from social interactions. So that also means, because I have to be clear, this means that they did not go to work, they did not engage in any training, they did not engage in associative work, so they completely recluse, often to their room, and only leave in the room to share family dinners, but not necessarily to see guests or communicate with the family, just to share dinner and then they leave back. And sometimes they don't even speak during dinner time, so it's not a moment of sharing, a family sharing. So what Maïa Fansten very interestingly pointed out is that often the Hikikomoris have this feeling that they want to be invisible. They don't want to participate in social life, in gatherings, in society on the whole. And what is very interesting, what you pointed out, is that there's an overwhelming number of very young people, that in the Hikikomori state, it seems to be overly young men, but not only, right, but overwhelmingly statistically, young men that isolate and don't want to take part. So basically, what that phenomena that Saito, the psychiatrist, saw in Japan in the 90s is not confined to Japanese culture. So there's been examples in Korea, but more and more we're seeing this phenomena happen in, for example, Italy, Germany, France. So it's starting to go more global. Her hypothesis, her working hypothesis, is that nowadays with social media there's much more connection, so we don't go as mad, quote unquote, as we would if we didn't have our screens that connect us to the world. Therefore, the Hikikomori state is in a way facilitated by the current technology and also by a family dynamic which has a lot of issues working with the individual to grow out of this state. So very fundamentally, all of this, if you know my content and if you know the schizoid personality, directly me associate with the schizoid personality a form of withdrawalness in which the individual over-amplifies their own subjectivity and withdraws from social interactions and the world in general to focus on their inner world. And in the case she gave the case of Octave, which of course is not his real name, is a young man that does not want to be seen, and that non-seen is something that's very important to him. However, he has a whole mental framework and he's very interested in many things, including politics. So it's not that he has no interest, it's just that he does not want to participate, he doesn't want to interact, but he's very smart, very inward looking. So the parallel with schizoid seems to be very important, this withdrawal in oneself at the detriment of the outside world. And it seems to me that the Hikikomori state is very similar to the schizoid, And I would go so far as to say that it's perhaps one of the modern faces of schizoid personality. Because remember, I think in the time of Harry Guntrip, so technologies was not the same, society's expectations were not the same. Therefore, I don't think the schizoids could isolate themselves as to the extent that they can now. Because now, in truth, right now, a human can absolutely have no contact with another human. They can work remotely, they can ask for delivery apps, so they don't even need to do their groceries, they don't need to get out of their home. A human, an individual, can live completely excluded from society if they wanted to, or in a moment of hermitness. I'm gonna get there. So they can be complete hermits if they ever wanted to, and they don't need to interact. So our technology facilitates that. And in the terms of hikikomoris, they have gone to the full extent of removing themselves. In a way, they've fulfilled the schizoid fantasies of full autonomy towards the outside world, which would implicate that there is a correlation between both states. So, very, very fundamentally, the schizoid, to the extent if he becomes an Hikikomori, he might be in the more severe gradients of or degrees of the schizoid personality, because basically there is a form of full complete withdrawal from humanity. They don't even expect anything anymore. That they just completely into the inner world, and they completely feed themselves through their inner world. When I mean feed, I mean that every individual has projects, things that they like, enjoy. And in the case of severe schizoid personalities, the pleasure only comes from the inner world. Therefore, the external world is completely absent or completely rejected. And that's often something that can be very difficult. For example, the parents don't understand that the child does not have any projects, that they don't not aiming at integrating society. Quite the opposite, they're aiming to avoid it at all possible cost. Therefore, one can maintain these two states in parallel from one another. However, and this is going to be important, there are many differences. For example, in terms of psychopathology, Hikkikomori could technically be a plethora of individuals with different psychopathologies. Because as we know, for example, in the case of premorbid schizophrenia, it often develops as an extreme form of isolation. So it's not impossible for example, someone who has an Hikikomori state to basically be a pre-morbid schizophrenic that's so afraid that they completely withdraw to avoid persecution or delusions or to obey the voices, which start to be there but are not fully proactive yet. It could also be an autistic state in which the individual does not want to interact because the outside world is too overwhelming, too, in terms of sensations, too intrusive, and that they don't want to interact because that's too scary, too frightening, therefore they don't want that. And also, in states of infantile psychosis, there can be a form of withdrawal that can lead to some form of catatonia, where the individual does not interact at all with the outside world. So, as you can see, there's a plethora of possibilities in terms of psychopathology, which is not limited to the schizoid personality. And also, very interestingly enough, what the professor explained to the audience during the conference is that Hikkikomori is not a diagnosis. It's not like a schizoid personality, pre-morbid schizophrenia, and so on and so forth, or depression, which could also be a cause or an explanation. No. It's because there's no psychiatrist or psychologist that did a diagnosis that Hikkikomori is put down as a syndrome. It's because there's no one to precisely evaluate it. Because as she explained very well, psychiatry has not waited for the term Hikkikomori to try and understand withdrawal and what causes a human to withdraw and not interact anymore. So we can see that there's already a difference on that level. Also a very interesting difference seems to me to be the question of dependency. Because if you, for example, have read Harry Guntrip, he points out that the schizoid individual wants full autonomy, that they don't want to rely on anyone, they don't want to be dependent because that's frightening, that would be to be potentially hurt or abused by others, so therefore they want to rely completely on themselves, which contradicts the state of Hikkikomori, because often the Hikkikomoris rely heavily on the family and mainly the parents to basically feed them, basically give them a roof over their heads, and so on and so forth. So the Hikikomori state does require some form of help from the environment. It can't be done really alone. Or if it is done alone, very interesting point. If it's done, if they do it by themselves, they will completely evade the statistics and even the fact of being interacted with. Because what happens is that often in the states that we know about, the Hikikomoris, it's the parents that see a problem, see an issue, and want their child to be helped, be it through psychotherapy, through medication, through social work, and so on and so forth. But they want the child to leave that state. That's something that they often desire. Therefore, it pushes the child to seek help, or at least even themselves. Therefore, the Hikikomoris cannot become invisible with their parents, because the parents won't allow fully for them to become invisible, which implies something interesting. That means that if a Hikikomori is self-sufficient, then he evades the radar completely, meaning that most likely we only have young people and young men because perhaps women do it better, or perhaps it's not expected of women to socialize as much as men, or because adult hikikomoris are completely in a branch where they can do everything by themselves. As I was saying earlier, the technology is now there to do everything remotely, basically. So, very important point. Therefore, perhaps that difference is not that much an important one, because those that are completely the schizoid hikikomoris are so isolated that we don't even see them, we don't even know that they exist, yet they're there. And I also found it very, very interesting, this notion of becoming invisible to the outside world, because it's often something that the schizoid fantasizes about, that their identity, that they would be invisible, that no one would see them, that they would be completely, fully, utterly protected. And it seems to me that there is something of that ilk in the Hikkikomori phenomena, in which the Hikkikomoris do not want to be seen, they want to be protected. And perhaps also, and this is an important point that was brought up by a social worker during the conference, perhaps there's a freezing of time in the Hikkikomori state, which could be true because in also the schizoid states, i.e. when you freeze time, there's a form of powerfulness in this idea of freezing time. If you freeze time, you're completely safe. And I have to reiterate, this is not me that has thought of this, it's this social worker. But I found the idea brilliant. So if this social worker finds this video, know that I just want you to let you know that your idea was like top notch. And in terms of my ideas, what I thought about this is that there's also a form of underpinning aggression that is never released, that the Hikkikomori in a way is not aggressive enough to fight for themselves, to fight against the world, because it's true, the outside world is a struggle. You always have to fight your way through. It's not nothing is given, everything is fought for. And therefore the Hikkikomori might not feel that they can fight for themselves, fight for what they need. And basically they might not even be able to stand up to their parents. And this is maybe why they get help, is that they can't stand up. Also, very interesting, and the parallel is also, I think, of high value, is that the Hikikomoris that were questioned seem to be of a intellectually natured people that are very preoccupied with their intellect, and often even went so far as to like tease and mock the sociologist, explaining that they would not even care about them in 20 years. And this reminded me of the type of schizoid that Gunship describes in his book, The Schizoid Phenomena, Object Relations and the Self, which are eerily similar to what he describes of this form of independence of like, you'll never be able to touch me, and in a way I understand the problem so much better than you could ever. This form of arrogance that is not narcissistic. It is like, I am above you, therefore I don't need you, and I don't need your help, which is, again, very, very interesting. Another important question was asked to her, to the professor, was, and I found this also incredibly interesting, how have you met these people if they're incredibly recluse? Well, she says that this Hikkikomori phenomena is not necessarily an all or nothing kind of situation. It is varies in degrees. And she said that at the core of the crisis, like when the person is completely isolated, there's no meeting, there's no even question of it. But sometimes they're more open. For example, some of them can even like leave their homes, do a couple of activities, but they're not in full employment, or they're not in full working. So basically, you can still meet them, you can still interact with them at certain points. And during those interactions, it is made very clear that they know full well this is not necessarily something that they suffer from. Like the schizoid will not necessarily, at least on a conscious level, suffer from isolation, but that suffering might be there. Therefore, she also works with psychologists and psychiatrists to try and evaluate. So fundamentally, these two states of Hikikomori and schizoid seem to me to be a match made in heaven, so to speak, in the sense that the schizoid state does imply some form of isolation, which does seem coherent with the Hikikomori state. But I think we can't infer that all Hikikomoris are schizoid per essence. I think that I'm going to go out on a limb, right? This is a guess. But I assume that a very big portion of them are, but not all, because of the psychotic, pre-morbid psychosis that I talked about, because of depression, because of autism. There can be a whole plethora of other conditions that make that occur. But it seems to me that the closest thing, at least I know of, is the schizoid state. So it seems to me that there are parallels. And those parallels are quite strong. And it would be also a new way of seeing this state because, as I said, contrary to what we believe, it's not just a Japanese phenomenon. It's starting to happen in all of the West. And as a sociologist, a professor that I've seen basically went and implied that because our societies are becoming more and more stressful and less hopeful, that young people don't want to engage in it anymore, don't want to bother because it's already lost in a way that's perhaps more deep and more profound than it was in the 60s. Therefore, what's the point of investing in something that's in decay? And I must admit that it's a good point to make because it's hard to invest something that we know is going to go downhill. So it's not easy for the young people. And I don't want to over-pathologize and create a division between the youth of the 60s that was joyful, because I think there was a lot of issues also at that time, and the youth of nowadays, let's say, which has its problems. I think the youths of all generations have had problems, but perhaps our generation, I say our because I'm relatively young, but let's say the 90s till the 2000 and 2010 generation have this problem of lack of hope, which maybe would not have been exactly the same for the people born in the 80s, 60s, 70s, and so on and so forth. So it might not have been exactly the same, but I think that every generation has their generational struggle. So that's for the generational part of it. So fundamentally, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I'll see you the next time. Bye.